I hadn't thought about Michael's cabin in years. After the divorce, I made myself stay away from that part of the woods, even though it was only a 30-minute drive from town. There was something about that place that always left a knot in my stomach, even back when we were together. He loved it there, said it was his escape, a place where the world couldn't get to him. I never felt that way. The silence pressed down too heavy. The shadows seemed longer than they should have been, and the isolation made me restless. It was early October of 2016 when I finally passed by it again. I was 39 then, driving home from visiting my sister who lived on the other side of the county. The road wound through stretches of forest, the kind that looked endless, the kind where you could stop the car and not see a single sign of another person for hours. As I came around one of the sharper turns, I recognized the dirt path that cut off from the main road. It was barely visible, hidden under fallen leaves, but I knew it instantly. That was the path that led to his cabin. I slowed down without even realizing it, my headlights catching the slant of the wooden post he had once hammered into the ground to mark the way. The post leaned more than it used to, weather-rotted and cracked, the red paint almost gone. My chest tightened. I hadn't thought of him in months, but that sight brought it all back. The smell of his cigarettes on the porch, the sound of him splitting wood out back, the heavy silence after our fights. I kept driving past the path at first, telling myself I didn't care, that I had no reason to stop. But then, only a mile down, I pulled the car over onto the shoulder. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I just sat there for a long moment, engine humming, heart beating too fast for no real reason. Then, almost against my own will, I turned the car around and headed back. When I pulled onto the dirt path, my tires crunched over the thick blanket of leaves. The road was worse than I remembered, eaten up by rainwater channels and roots poking through the ground. I had to crawl along carefully, weaving around the dips so I didn't bottom out. Branches scraped across the roof of my car, a high screech that made my teeth clench. After about 10 minutes of slow driving, the cabin came into view. It looked smaller than I remembered, but maybe that was just the years passing. The wood was darker, damp from the constant shade of the trees. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, shingles missing in patches. A broken gutter hung down like a snapped bone. The front porch where we used to sit had warped boards, some bent upward. The windows were clouded with dirt, one of them cracked. For a while, I just sat in the car and stared at it. My chest was tight, and I could feel the sweat on my palms even though the air was cold enough to fog the glass. It looked abandoned, but not in the peaceful way some old houses do. It looked left behind in a rush, like something had driven life out of it. I finally stepped out, crunching over the leaves. The air was sharp and damp, carrying that earthy rot smell of wet wood and fallen foliage. Every sound seemed too loud. My footsteps, the slam of the car door, the soft creak of tree branches overhead. The front steps groaned when I tested them with my weight. I half expected them to collapse under me, but they held. I touched the door frame out of habit. The wood was rough and cold, splinters breaking away under my fingers. My mind kept flashing to memories I didn't want. Michael sitting in his chair by the window, staring too long at nothing, or him standing outside at night smoking in the dark while I watched from bed, wondering why he wouldn't come in. I didn't go inside right away. I circled the cabin first, moving slow, every nerve in me awake. The shed out back was still there, the one where he kept his tools and fishing gear, though its roof had collapsed halfway. I could see rusted metal through the broken boards, something jagged sticking out. The chopping block was still by the shed, though it was split down the middle, weeds growing up around it. An old axe leaned against it, the head eaten with rust, handle swollen and cracked from years of rain. I tried to shake off the unease building in my stomach, but I couldn't. The woods pressed too close around the clearing. The trees leaned inward, their branches tangled like arms reaching down. I felt exposed out there, like the cabin wasn't empty at all but was watching me. Finally, I went back to the front and pushed the door. It swung open with a loud groan, the sound echoing inside. The smell hit me first. Stale air, mold, and something sharp underneath, like old rot. Dust floated in the light spilling through the broken window. The living room looked almost the same, only covered in layers of neglect. The old sofa sagged deeper than I remembered, the fabric torn open to show yellow stuffing. The table we used to eat at was overturned, one leg broken. Papers were scattered across the floor, curled with moisture. I stepped carefully inside, my boots crunching on glass from the cracked window. The silence was thick, heavy enough that I could hear my own breathing. I moved through each room slowly, heart pounding like I was waiting for something to jump out. Even though I knew better, the kitchen cabinets hung open, some doors broken off. A pot still sat on the stove, blackened with mold inside. The bedroom was worse. The mattress had caved in, springs jutting up, and the dresser drawers were pulled halfway out like someone had rifled through them and never finished. Every corner I looked into, I half expected to see Michael sitting there, like the years had folded in on themselves and brought him back. But there was nothing, just the slow groan of the cabin settling and the faint tap of water dripping somewhere inside the walls. I told myself I was just looking, just passing through, but my body didn't believe it. My chest was tight, my throat dry, my skin crawling like I was being watched. It wasn't ghosts and it wasn't imagination. It was the weight of knowing what had happened here, what had been left behind. All the fights, the cold silences, the nights when his temper filled the air thicker than smoke. The place hadn't forgotten, and neither had I. I didn't stay long, maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. My pulse never slowed, not once. The air inside was too heavy, too suffocating. By the time I stepped back out onto the porch, I was shaking without meaning to. The daylight was fading fast, shadows stretching long across the clearing. I could hear the woods around me waking up with night sounds, branches snapping, something moving low through the brush. I walked fast to the car, not running but close. My hands trembled as I pulled the door open and slid inside. I sat there for a second, gripping the wheel, staring at the cabin through the windshield. My chest heaved like I'd been holding my breath the whole time. And then I knew, clear as day, that I would never come back here again. Not because I was scared of the cabin itself, but because I finally understood. The place was a shell, nothing more, but it carried every weight I had tried to leave behind with Michael. The anger, the fear, the long nights of silence. It lived in those walls, soaked into the wood, and stepping inside had dragged it all back into me. I put the car in gear and drove out fast, branches scraping across the roof like nails. When I hit the main road again, I didn't look back once. I kept my eyes straight ahead, hands tight on the wheel, and promised myself that was the last time I'd ever let that place pull me in. The cabin was his, not mine. It always had been, and leaving it behind, for good this time, felt like the only way to finally be free. I was 31 when I went back to my grandmother's old cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. The year was 1998, late September, when the air had that sharp bite in the mornings and the trees were turning into heavy shades of orange and red. The cabin had been empty for almost 12 years, ever since my grandmother passed away, and no one in the family had bothered to sell it. It just sat there, falling apart slowly, as if time had been waiting for someone to return. I don't know what made me drive up there that weekend, but I had a few days off work, and part of me wanted to see the place again, to walk around the woods I remembered from childhood, and maybe get away from the noise of the city. The drive took almost 6 hours. By the time I turned onto the long dirt road that led to the cabin, The sun was low, staining everything with a dull golden light. The road was rough, full of ruts, and the trees pressed in close on both sides. When the cabin finally came into view, my chest tightened. The roof sagged slightly, the front steps were leaning, and weeds had swallowed most of the small yard. The window shutters were still there, though crooked, and the door's paint had peeled into gray flakes. I parked the car a few feet away and just sat for a while, staring at it. The silence was heavy. No cars, no neighbors, not even the buzz of power lines. Just the sound of wind through dry leaves and the occasional crack of a branch. The lock on the front door was rusty, but the key my mother gave me still worked. The smell hit me as soon as I opened it. Old wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like damp cloth left too long in the corner. Inside, the place looked almost the same as I remembered. The old stone fireplace dominated the living room. The furniture was covered with sheets, yellowed with age. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the wooden floor creaked under every step. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked around. The kitchen had rust spots on the sink and cracked tiles on the counter. The cabinets still held a few cans of food, probably as old as me by now. The bedroom smelled worse, like mold. The bed frame was intact, but the mattress was sagging and stained. A closet door hung open, and inside were a few of my grandmother's coats, stiff with dust, their shoulders lined with mouse droppings. Felt strange being there alone. The air seemed too still. I opened a window to let some of the smell out, but the screen had holes, and I could already imagine insects finding their way inside. As night fell, I lit a couple of old oil lamps I found in the cabinet because the electricity wasn't working. The soft light threw shadows across the walls. I made a simple dinner out of bread, cheese, and bottled water I brought along. The cabin groaned with every gust of wind, and the sound of branches scratching against the roof reminded me of fingernails dragging across wood. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just not used to this kind of silence anymore. Later, when I stepped outside to use the old outhouse behind the cabin, I noticed how dark the woods were. The sky was clear, full of stars, but underneath the trees, the blackness was so deep it seemed solid. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. As I stood there, I heard something moving in the distance. A crunch of leaves, then silence. My heart beat faster. Probably a deer, maybe even a raccoon. But the sound was heavier, slower. I held my breath and listened, but nothing followed. Back inside, I bolted the door and tried to get some sleep. The mattress was uncomfortable, and the smell of mildew made my nose itch. Every small noise woke me. The wind pushing against the walls, a mouse scurrying across the ceiling beams, the faint rustle of something outside the window. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps on the porch. Not quick ones, not the light shuffle of an animal, but slow, heavy steps, like someone testing the boards. My chest tightened, and I lay completely still, listening. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the faint glow of the lamp on the dresser. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, but it wasn't restful. I dreamed of doors creaking open, of someone standing at the foot of the bed, breathing. When I woke, it was still dark. My watch said 4:27 a.m. The cabin was silent again, but I felt unsettled, like I wasn't alone. I got up, wrapped my jacket around me, and checked the windows. The glass was fogged from the inside, but nothing seemed unusual. I walked quietly to the front door and made sure the bolt was still in place. It was, but when I glanced down, I froze. There were marks on the wooden floor, just inside the door. Small flecks of mud, like someone had stepped in with dirty boots. My boots were clean. I had left them near the bed. A chill ran through me. I tried to convince myself that I must have dragged the dirt in yesterday without noticing, but the prints looked too fresh, damp against the dry wood. I sat in the chair near the window until the sky started to lighten. As soon as it was morning, I walked outside to check around the cabin. The ground was covered with fallen leaves, but I noticed disturbances near the porch, as if someone had walked there during the night. The prints weren't sharp enough to make out shoes, but the ground was definitely pressed down. They led a few steps toward the woods, then disappeared. That entire day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even when I went down to the lake a few hundred yards away, the silence felt too heavy, as though the trees were holding something in. I tried to distract myself by gathering firewood and cleaning a bit inside the cabin, but every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard movement behind me. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something scraping along the outside wall. A slow drag, then a pause, then another drag. My skin crawled. I didn't move, just listened, heart pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in the room. The noise circled part of the cabin, then stopped near the front door. A long silence followed. I finally forced myself to grab the old hunting knife my grandmother kept in the kitchen drawer. I sat in the chair, knife in hand, waiting. Hours passed. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, daylight was leaking through the cracks in the shutters. When I stepped outside in the morning, I found more disturbances in the leaves, clear this time. Footprints, unmistakable, leading up to the porch. They weren't mine, too large. Whoever had been there had walked slowly around the cabin, pausing near the windows. My stomach twisted. I realized then how stupid it had been to come alone. There was no phone signal this far out, no electricity, no neighbors for miles. If someone wanted to break in, there would be nothing I could do. I didn't waste any more time. I packed my bag, shoved it into the car, and didn't even bother to clean up. My hands shook as I started the engine, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. But the woods stayed still, watching. When I finally reached the highway, the relief was so strong I almost cried. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, back in the noise and safety of traffic and streetlights. I never went back to the cabin again. A few months later, my mother told me she had sold the property to a logging company. I didn't argue. Even now, I can still picture those footprints in the leaves, circling the cabin while I slept inside. I tell myself it was probably just some hunter or drifter passing through. But the way they lingered, the way they stood at the door in the middle of the night, it didn't feel like someone just passing through. And that thought has stayed with me all these years. I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in northern Montana for almost 4 months when the first real scare of my life happened. I was 27, not new to the outdoors, but not seasoned like the older rangers who had spent decades in the forest. My assignment was a small one-room ranger cabin near the edge of Glacier National Park, built back in the 1950s, about 20 miles from the main ranger station. The cabin was simple. Wooden walls darkened from age, a tin roof, a cot in one corner, a wood stove, a desk stacked with radio logs, and a single kerosene lamp for light when the generator went down. It wasn't the kind of place meant for comfort. It was for function, a shelter in case of storms, and a post where I was expected to check trails, watch fire risks, and keep track of who came in and out of that section of the park. It was September of 1998, and the weather had started to shift. The nights grew colder, and the air carried that sharp edge that hinted at winter. Tourists still came through, but fewer now, mostly hikers who knew how to handle themselves and hunters who knew where the borders of the park ended. My cabin sat off a dirt road that was easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. During the day, it looked harmless enough. An old ranger outpost tucked between tall pines, with the mountains rising blue and gray in the distance. At night, though, it felt different. The trees pressed in, and the silence seemed heavier than anywhere else I had been. That particular week, I had been on solo watch. The other ranger, a man named Carl, had gone down to the main station to help with paperwork and equipment checks, leaving me with 4 days alone at the cabin. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet, and I had plenty of small tasks to keep me busy. Clearing branches from the trail, checking fire pits for hot coals, logging weather patterns, and reporting by radio twice a day. The rain came on the second night. Not just a light drizzle, but steady sheets that pounded the roof and made the whole cabin smell like wet pine. I kept the stove running, boiling coffee just to keep the damp cold from setting in. Around 9, I shut off the radio, wrote in the logbook, and sat at the desk listening to the storm. The sound of rain against the tin roof was so loud that every little creak inside the cabin made me turn my head. I reminded myself that old wood shifts, that wind pushes at the walls, but my nerves stayed awake longer than I wanted them to. By midnight, I lay on the cot staring at the ceiling. The lamp had burned out hours before, and I didn't feel like refilling it. The only light came from the faint orange glow through the cracks of the stove. Just as I was about to doze off, I thought I heard something that wasn't rain. A sound sharper, closer. I froze, waiting, my eyes wide in the dark. A branch snapping, maybe. Could have been a deer. That part of the forest had plenty of them. Still, the noise had been distinct. Something heavy moving, not just branches swaying. I forced myself to stay still, listening. The rain covered most sounds, but every now and then, I swore I caught a shuffle outside the cabin walls. It made no sense for anyone to be out there at that hour. The nearest road was too far, and hikers didn't wander around in storms like that. I told myself I was being jumpy, rolled over, and pulled the blanket tighter. But not 5 minutes later, there came another sound. This time, the hollow thud of something against the cabin wall. It wasn't hard enough to be an attack, not like someone was trying to break in, but it was deliberate. A knock, almost. I sat up fast, my pulse hammering, and reached for the flashlight by the cot. The beam cut through the dark, and I swept it over the door, the corners, the windows. Everything looked the same. The sound didn't repeat. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat at the desk, boots back on, flashlight ready, waiting for morning. At some point, I must have drifted off in the chair, because when I opened my eyes, gray light was creeping through the trees outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I walked out with stiff legs and wet air filling my lungs. The ground around the cabin was soft and slick, my boots sinking into mud. I looked for prints, half expecting to find deer tracks. Instead, about 20 feet from the door, I saw something else, boot prints. Not the heavy kind rangers wore, not like mine. These were thinner, almost like work boots, and they were fresh. They circled near the cabin, then disappeared into the tree line. My stomach sank. Whoever had been there, they had been close, and I had heard them. I followed the trail a short way, but stopped when the prints broke apart in the wet ground. The forest felt too quiet that morning. The rain muffled everything, but I had the uneasy sense of being watched. I backed off and returned to the cabin, locking the door even though I knew it wouldn't do much. The day dragged on with no sign of anyone. I kept busy splitting some kindling, checking the trail up to the ridge, and forcing myself to radio in as if nothing was wrong. But the thought of those prints stayed with me. No one had logged in at the main entrance. No reports of missing hikers. Nothing. That meant someone had either slipped past unnoticed or didn't care about being tracked. That night, I tried to convince myself it had been a hunter who got lost and circled near the cabin by mistake. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that knock, that dull sound against the wall. The storm picked up again, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the wind. I sat with the flashlight on my lap, every sense strained. Around midnight, I heard it again. Not just one sound this time, but a series of soft steps outside the window. I clicked off the light, my heart racing. The stove glowed faintly, but otherwise the cabin was dark. Whoever was out there moved slowly, almost testing the ground. The steps paused right outside the wall where my cot was. Then another thud against the wood. Not loud, but firm. I gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles hurt. Every instinct told me not to move, not to let whoever it was know I was awake. The steps shifted, circling toward the back of the cabin. Then silence. Minutes crawled by. I sat frozen, every muscle tight, listening for the smallest sound. Finally, after what felt like an hour, I realized the steps weren't coming back. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I went outside again, and sure enough, more prints were there. The same boots, circling the cabin again, this time closer, pressing deeper into the mud. Whoever it was had stood just outside my window for long enough to leave heavy impressions. I checked the tree line with binoculars, but nothing moved. That morning, I packed everything tight and radioed in an early request for pickup. I didn't tell them the full story. I just said there had been signs of possible trespassers, and I didn't want to leave the cabin unattended. By noon, Carl came up the road with the truck. He gave me a look when I told him I hadn't slept and pointed out the prints. His face hardened. We left the cabin locked and didn't linger. Back at the main station, they sent a small team to sweep the area. They found the prints, same as I had, but they faded into the trees and never showed up again. No hunters checked in wearing boots like that, and no locals admitted to being near the cabin. Whoever it had been, they stayed off record. I didn't go back to that cabin alone after that. The others teased me at first, but when they saw the seriousness in my face, they stopped. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there in the storm, circling in the dark, waiting by the walls while I sat inside. Even now, years later, I can still remember the sound of that knock. Not random, not careless, but intentional. A quiet signal in the night that someone was there, watching, deciding how close they could come. That old ranger cabin may still be standing, but I never trusted its walls again. I had been driving for hours that autumn evening in 1997, trying to find the old property my uncle once owned. He had passed years ago, and the land had been left to me in a messy inheritance that no one else in the family cared about. I didn't know much about it, just that it was somewhere outside a small town in northern Pennsylvania. I had printed directions from an old map, but the roads didn't line up the way they should have. I got lost twice before finally spotting a rusted wire gate, half hidden by weeds, with a wooden sign nailed to the post. The letters were faint, nearly eaten away by weather, but I could still make out my uncle's last name. The driveway was more like a trail, 2 worn tire grooves leading uphill through thick woods. Branches scraped against the sides of my car as I crawled along. The sun was sinking, the woods dim and wet from the morning's rain. I finally reached a clearing where a small cabin stood, the roof sagging, the porch leaning like it might fall if I stepped on it. What unsettled me most wasn't the state of the cabin, but what stretched behind it. Just beyond the back lot was a graveyard. It wasn't a large one, maybe 20 or 30 graves, but the sight froze me. The crooked stones, some leaning, some broken in half, sat in rows that faded into tall grass. Iron fencing bordered part of it, but most of the fence had fallen. It didn't look like a public cemetery. It looked private, almost forgotten. I didn't know my uncle well, but I didn't remember him ever saying he lived next to a graveyard. I unlocked the cabin door with the old brass key my mother had kept in a box of family things. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew. The single-room cabin had a wood stove, a cot, a table, and not much else. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, and water stains spread across the ceiling like brown shadows. I walked around carefully, brushing spider webs from my arms, checking corners for animals or nests. I had told myself I would stay the night, just to see what the place was like. But standing inside it, the thought felt heavier. I dropped my bag on the cot and stepped back outside. The graveyard caught my eyes again. The stones were old, many carved in the 1800s, judging by the dates I could read. A few had names still visible: Collins, Rourke, Whitman. Some stones were so faded they looked blank. The ground was uneven, dips and mounds where the earth had settled over coffins long gone soft. A huge oak tree grew at the edge of the graves, its roots twisting through the soil like veins. The air grew colder as night came. I built a small fire in the stove using the pile of wood stacked on the porch. The flames filled the cabin with a dull orange glow. I sat at the table, trying to write down what I saw, but my mind kept circling back to the graves. Every time the wind shook the cabin, I imagined footsteps outside. Every creak in the wooden walls made me look toward the window. When I finally lay down on the cot, I kept the lantern burning. I didn't trust the dark in that place. I could see the graveyard through the small window above me. The moon had risen, silver light spilling across the stones. I lay there for hours, listening to the wind scrape through the trees, until at last I fell asleep. I woke sometime after midnight. The fire in the stove had died, and the cabin was cold enough that I could see my breath. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a sound outside, slow, uneven, crunching leaves, then silence. Crunch, silence, like someone walking carefully through the woods. I froze, every muscle tight. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps came closer, circling near the cabin. Crunch, pause, crunch. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the lantern. Its flame was low, barely giving enough light. I thought about calling out, but the idea of my voice breaking the silence made my stomach twist. The steps moved toward the graveyard. I stood at the window and saw a figure between the stones. A man, maybe. He was bent low, moving slowly, like he was searching for something among the graves. The moon lit his outline, but I couldn't see his face. He wasn't carrying a light. He just moved from stone to stone, crouching, standing again, moving on. I backed away from the window, afraid he would see me watching. I sat on the cot, lantern in my lap, waiting. My mind raced with questions. Why would someone be in a graveyard at that hour? Who was he? After what felt like an hour, the footsteps stopped. I didn't hear him leave. I didn't hear anything at all, just the wind through the trees. Eventually, my body ached from sitting so still. I forced myself to lie back down, though my eyes stayed open until the sky outside began to pale with morning. When daylight came, I finally worked up the nerve to go outside. The grass was wet with dew, my shoes soaking through as I walked to the graveyard. I searched the ground for footprints, half expecting to find nothing, like it had been a trick of my mind. But the earth was soft from yesterday's rain, and I saw them clearly. Bootprints, fresh ones. They weaved between the graves, circling them, stopping at several stones. I followed the prints to the far end of the graveyard. The soil there had been disturbed. A patch of dirt looked freshly dug, darker than the rest, the grass torn away. The earth was uneven, and a shovel lay on the ground nearby, half buried in mud. Someone had been digging in the night. My stomach turned as I realized what it meant. Someone had been trying to dig up a grave, maybe looking for valuables buried with the dead. Maybe something worse. The thought of him out there, crouched between the stones while I lay only yards away in the cabin, made my skin crawl. I didn't stay. I packed my bag, locked the door, and drove out the rough driveway as fast as I could. I didn't look back at the cabin or the graves behind it. The whole place felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had stepped outside in the dark, if I had made a sound, the man in the graveyard would have known I was there. I never returned to that property. Months later, I read in the local paper that police had arrested a man for grave robbing in that area. They said he had been digging up old family plots, looking for jewelry or coins buried with the dead. I don't know if it was the same man I saw, but I didn't need confirmation. I already knew. The cabin still belongs to me, but I will never go back. Every time I think about it, I see the boot prints in the wet soil, circling the graves while I lay frozen just a few yards away. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural that made that place terrifying. It was something worse, another person, someone alive, in the dark, moving quietly among the dead. I had taken a short trip to the countryside of Northumberland in late autumn of 2016. I wasn't looking for anything more than quiet. I rented a small wooden cabin not far from a stream, tucked back into a line of dark pines. The place had been advertised as simple but private, and that was exactly what I wanted. I was 32 then, tired from city work, needing distance from everything. The cabin itself was old, not falling apart but clearly lived in by many people before me. The floor creaked everywhere, no matter how lightly I walked. The windows were thin, with condensation forming on the inside during the nights. The furniture was plain. Just a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a rust-stained sink tucked in the corner. There was electricity, but the lights buzzed and flickered as if the wires were half-rotted. Still, I told myself it was fine. It wasn't luxury I had come for. The first day passed quietly. I walked along the stream, gathered firewood, and sat reading with a mug of tea as the light fell behind the trees. The silence was thick out there, deeper than I'd expected. Even when the wind pushed through the pines, it felt muffled, like the trees swallowed the sound. By evening, I locked the door, pulled the blanket up, and convinced myself that the small creaks in the roof were only the cabin settling. The second night was colder. The air felt sharp in my chest when I stepped outside to smoke. I stood on the porch and watched the field beyond the trees fade into darkness. The moon was just a thin slice, enough to throw pale light across the clearing. That was when I noticed her for the first time. She stood at the far edge of the trees, on the open side of the clearing where the ground dipped slightly before the field stretched out. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The figure was tall, thin, and very still. She wore a long coat, dark, hanging almost to her boots. Her hair looked pale against the dark behind her, maybe gray, maybe blonde. I couldn't tell from that distance. I froze with the cigarette burning down between my fingers. She didn't move. She didn't even look like she was breathing. I waited, staring, my heart heavy in my chest. I told myself it was a farmer, maybe someone walking home across the field, maybe someone just cutting through. But she was standing too still, too deliberate, like she had been standing there long before I noticed her. I went inside, locked the door again, and sat listening. The woods stayed quiet. No steps, no branches breaking, no sound of anyone walking closer. After half an hour of sitting at the table staring at the floor, I finally went to bed. The next morning, I tried to reason with myself. It had been dark, I had been tired, maybe I had only seen a shadow in the shape of a person. The field was empty in daylight. The trees looked ordinary again. I convinced myself I had overreacted. But that night, when I stepped outside again, she was there. Same spot, same stillness. This time closer, though 5 or 6 steps out from the line of trees, her coat shifting faintly in the wind. I didn't wait to see more. I went inside, locked the door, and slid the heavy chair under the handle. The third night, I didn't even try going outside. I sat in the cabin with the lights off, listening to the quiet press in from the woods. Around midnight, there was a sound outside on the porch, a faint scuff, the slow drag of weight against wood. My mouth went dry. I sat frozen on the bed, barely breathing. The noise came again, heavier, like a shoe scraping the step. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the heavy flashlight I had brought with me. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door. The porch boards were damp from frost, and there were marks, 2 faint prints on the step. Shoes narrow, the tread shallow, as if the soles were worn thin. I thought about leaving that morning. I packed my bag halfway, then stopped. Something about running felt worse. The cabin had been booked for 5 nights, and I told myself it was paranoia, that maybe it was just a local woman, that maybe I was blowing this up in my head. But the 4th night broke that excuse. The evening was dead still, no wind, no movement in the trees. I had forced myself to eat, sitting at the table with the lamp on, when I heard the soft knock. Not on the door, but on the glass of the side window. 3 slow taps. I didn't move. My whole body locked tight. The lamp made the glass into a mirror, and I couldn't see out into the dark. My ears rang with the silence after the knocks. I didn't breathe until the light began to flicker, buzzing faintly, and I switched it off. I sat in the dark for hours, waiting, hearing nothing else. When I finally stood and dared to look at the window, there were faint smudges on the glass. Not clear handprints, just streaks low down, as though someone's fingertips had pressed against it gently. That was when I packed everything for good. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for the morning light, and as soon as the sun came up, I shoved my bag into the car and started down the track that led to the road. The fields looked empty. The woods looked harmless in daylight. But when I glanced back at the cabin as I pulled onto the road, I saw her again. She was standing on the porch, one hand resting against the doorframe. Her coat hung stiff, her hair loose over her shoulders, her body motionless as ever. She was watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until the trees disappeared in the rearview mirror and the open countryside stretched wide around me. For weeks afterward, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe she was a local squatter, someone living out in the woods. Maybe she had been watching the cabin long before I rented it. Maybe she came to see who was inside, curious or looking for something. I never found out. What I do know is that I have never gone back to a cabin since. Whenever I drive through quiet stretches of countryside now, I catch myself checking the tree line, half expecting to see her standing there, still as stone, coat hanging loose, eyes fixed on me. And I know, with a kind of cold certainty, that if I had stayed one more night, she would not have just been standing outside anymore. It was the summer of 1997 when I drove out to a piece of land I had bought on the outskirts of Boone, North Carolina. I was 27 at the time, restless, tired of the city, and I thought I could build myself a small cabin out there as a way to get away when I needed peace. The land wasn't much, just 3 acres of thick woods on the slope of a hill, with an old dirt road cutting through. No one lived close by. The nearest house was about 2 miles down the road, and the main highway was at least 15 minutes away. I told myself I wanted quiet, but the truth was I wanted to prove something to myself. I'd been gathering materials little by little, hauling in lumber and supplies over several weekends. By early August, I had cleared a spot just big enough for a foundation. It wasn't much, just a flat square where the soil was hard enough to support the floor. I had no grand plan, just a rough sketch and stubborn determination. I figured it didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to keep me dry and give me a roof to sleep under. The day started gray and heavy, the air already thick with that smell that comes before rain. I parked my truck close to the clearing, unloaded my tools, and got to work. I had no idea the storm that was coming. By noon, the sky had turned the color of wet slate. The woods around me went quiet in that strange way they do before a storm. No birds, no insects, just stillness. I felt it in my chest, that drop in pressure, like the air itself had weight. But I pushed on. I set posts, nailed the first parts of the frame, and tried to ignore the rumble of thunder rolling in from the distance. When the rain finally came, it came hard. Thick sheets of water hammered down through the trees, turning the dirt to mud almost instantly. I pulled a tarp over the lumber stack, but the ground beneath me was already slick. I should have left, but I told myself I could at least get the floor laid before calling it quits. My hands shook as I worked, both from the cold, wet air and from the nerves I didn't want to admit I had. The woods felt different in the rain. Every gust of wind snapped branches overhead. The trees creaked, and the water gurgled in little rivulets around my boots. My hammer sounded louder than it should have, each strike echoing too long. I could feel how alone I was out there. By late afternoon, the rain hadn't stopped, only gotten heavier. I was soaked to the bone, my shirt plastered to my skin, jeans weighed down like sacks. I'd managed to get most of the floor beams in place and a partial wall frame, but my body was shaking with exhaustion. The mud sucked at my boots, pulling at me with every step. I started thinking about how far my truck was, how slick the slope would be driving down. That was when I realized the road might already be washed out. I kept telling myself I'd just finish one more section, but as the light dimmed, the woods grew darker faster than I expected. The storm clouds swallowed what was left of daylight, and the clearing fell into a gray gloom that made it hard to see. My hands were blistered, my knuckles scraped raw, my nails lined with mud. I tried to light my lantern, but the damp air kept killing the flame. When I finally got it lit, the weak glow only made the shadows stretch longer, the edges of the woods vanishing into black. Something about that moment hit me in the gut. I had no shelter, no real roof, nothing to stop the cold. The frame I had built was flimsy, open to the storm, nothing more than a skeleton of a cabin. My truck was my only way out, but I didn't even know if it would make it down the washed-out dirt road. I started to feel trapped. The rain drummed against the tarp, the sound mixing with the constant patter on leaves. Somewhere deeper in the trees, I heard a heavy crack, like a tree splitting under the weight of the storm. My heart jumped, and I looked around, half expecting to see something moving. But it was only the woods, thick and dark, pressing in from all sides. I forced myself back to the frame, hammering nails with numb fingers, just trying to keep busy. The lantern light flickered, making the walls around me seem to breathe. I thought I saw shapes shifting between the trees, but every time I looked straight, there was nothing. Just rain, just woods, just shadows. My own head was playing tricks on me. By the time night fully came, the storm was at its worst. The wind tore through the trees with such force I thought one would come down right on top of me. The rain was a steady roar, drowning out everything else. I crouched under the partial wall frame, clutching the lantern, and realized I couldn't keep working. I had to make a choice. Stay there in the half-built cabin with no roof, or try to reach the truck and drive out. I chose the truck. The walk back was worse than I expected. The mud nearly pulled my boots off with each step, and the water ran down the slope in streams that almost knocked me off my feet. My flashlight beam was weak, shaking in my hand, barely cutting through the sheets of rain. Every shadow looked like a figure standing still. Every fallen branch looked like something crouched in the mud. My chest was tight, and I couldn't tell if it was fear or just the cold. By the time I reached the truck, my whole body was trembling. The dirt road had turned into a mess of ruts and water channels. I climbed inside, dripping everywhere, and tried to start the engine. Coughed once, twice, then roared alive. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed, but the sound of the storm swallowed everything. I put it in gear and started creeping down the road. The tires slid more than they gripped, mud spraying out from under them. I kept both hands tight on the wheel, every nerve on edge. Branches lay across parts of the road, and I had to swerve around them, the truck fishtailing. At one point, the back end nearly spun out completely, and my heart slammed so hard I thought I'd black out. It took nearly 40 minutes to crawl down a stretch that usually took 10. By the time I hit the gravel road that connected to the highway, I was shaking from more than just the cold. I pulled over and just sat there, rain pounding the windshield, my breath fogging the glass. That night taught me more than any book or plan ever could. I had gone in thinking I could muscle through, that I could outwork the weather, that I was tougher than the woods. But the truth was, I had been reckless. The storm reminded me that nature doesn't bend to stubbornness, and the woods don't care about your plans. I didn't go back for 3 weeks. When I finally returned, the frame I had built was leaning, half collapsed from the storm. The tarp had shredded, and the lumber was swollen and warped. It was a mess, but I was alive, and I knew then what I hadn't known before, that building a cabin wasn't about brute effort or rushing against time. It was about patience, preparation, and respect for the place I had chosen to work in. That rainy night still lives in me, sharper than most other memories. I can still smell the wet wood, still feel the mud sucking at my boots, still hear the cracking of trees somewhere deep in the storm. I don't think I was ever truly in danger from anything but the weather and my own mistakes. But fear doesn't care about logic. Out there in the dark, with nothing but rain and trees and the unknown pressing in, fear is real. And that night, I learned to listen to it. I was 34 when I decided to take a trip to the mountains in northern Montana. It was late October of 2013, the air sharp and dry, the trees almost bare with only a few stubborn yellow leaves hanging on. I had rented a small cabin near Flathead National Forest. It wasn't fancy, just a single-room structure with a wood stove, a small table, a narrow bed, and no running water. The idea was to get away from everything, clear my head, and spend a week hiking and writing in my notebook. I thought isolation would do me good. The cabin sat about half a mile from the gravel road where I parked my truck. To reach it, I had to follow a narrow path winding through thick pine and fir trees. When I arrived, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky a dark orange. By the time I unpacked my food, water jugs, and sleeping bag, it was almost dark. The silence of the forest pressed in on me harder than I expected. Back home, even late at night, there were always distant car engines, voices, or dogs barking. Out here, there was nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. The first night passed quietly. I woke up a few times, half listening to the creaks of the cabin walls as they adjusted to the night cold. But I told myself it was just the old wood. In the morning, I chopped some wood for the stove, boiled water for instant coffee on a little camping burner, and wrote in my notebook until the sun rose higher. The day was simple: hiking a couple of miles on a nearby trail, eating granola bars and jerky, and sitting by the fire. I convinced myself that the isolation wasn't so bad. But on the third night, I started to notice things that didn't feel right. Around midnight, as I lay half asleep in the bed, I heard something move outside. At first it sounded like the shuffle of an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but then there was the distinct crunch of heavy steps. Not quick, light animal noises, but slow and deliberate footsteps on the dead leaves and pine needles outside the cabin. I held my breath and stared at the dark ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. The steps stopped after a minute, and I told myself maybe it was just a tree branch falling, or the echo of my imagination stretching sounds into something else. In the morning, I walked outside to check. I circled the cabin, scanning the dirt and leaves. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I was wearing hiking boots with a deep tread, and these prints looked different. They were smoother, like flat-soled shoes. They circled the cabin in a slow, uneven pattern, then disappeared back into the trees. My stomach sank. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. I tried hiking again, but every time the wind shifted or a branch cracked, I looked over my shoulder. The woods that had seemed peaceful now felt full of hidden eyes. I hurried back to the cabin earlier than planned and kept the fire going until the room was warm and bright, trying to comfort myself with the glow. That night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the same slow footsteps. They crunched closer, pausing, then moving again. I forced myself to stay completely still, my ears straining. Then I heard a soft scrape along the cabin wall, like something dragging across the wood. My chest tightened. I reached for the hatchet I kept by the bed, gripping the handle with sweaty hands, staring at the door. After maybe 5 minutes, the sounds stopped, but I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I found more footprints, closer this time, right up against the cabin walls. Whoever it was had stood near the window. I could almost imagine them peering in while I slept. The thought made me sick. I told myself I should leave. I packed some of my food into my backpack, ready to hike back to my truck. But when I stepped outside, I froze. Across the clearing, maybe 30 yards away, wedged between 2 trees, was a piece of fabric. A torn strip of dark blue cloth caught on the bark. It looked like it came from a jacket. I walked toward it slowly, my throat dry. The strip of cloth was old, frayed, and dirty. But what made my skin crawl was that it hadn't been there yesterday. Whoever had circled the cabin must have left it. I wanted to believe it was just some hunter passing through, maybe curious about the cabin. But hunters don't walk in circles around a place at night. Hunters don't press their faces to windows. That night, I stacked wood against the door and kept the fire burning higher than usual. The cabin grew hot, sweat rolling down my back, but I couldn't let the flames die down. Every sound outside made my heart race. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again, slow and heavy. This time, they didn't stop. They circled the cabin once, twice, 3 times, each lap slower than the last. Then silence. When the gray morning light finally came, I decided I was done. I wasn't staying another night. I stuffed everything into my pack, barely ate, and started down the trail to my truck. My eyes kept flicking to the trees, searching for movement. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. When I reached the road, I spotted my truck up ahead, relief flooding me, until I got closer. On the driver's side door, scratched into the paint, was a single long line, jagged and deep, running from the window down to the handle. My stomach turned. I checked the rest of the truck. Nothing was broken, the tires weren't slashed, but that single scratch was enough. It meant someone had been right here at my vehicle, waiting. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I drove away, I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. Back in town, I didn't tell anyone the full story. When the woman at the gas station asked if I'd enjoyed my time in the woods, I just nodded and said it was peaceful. But the truth was, I'd never felt more watched, more exposed in my life. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I sold all my camping gear the following spring. I still think about those footsteps circling in the dark, and the way the scratch looked on my truck door. Whoever it was out there, they weren't lost. They weren't hunting. They were waiting. And the part that sticks with me most is the silence of that last night, when the footsteps finally stopped. I never heard them walk away. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was the fall of 2012, and I had rented a small wooden cabin deep in the forests of northern Michigan. It wasn't one of those polished vacation cabins with glossy floors and hot tubs, but more of an old hunting shack that had been standing for decades. The roof sagged a little in the middle, the windows were thick with grime, and the porch steps creaked every time I walked on them. I didn't care. I wanted isolation. I wanted to hear the wind through the trees instead of car horns and chatter. I wanted the quiet, and I wanted to spend some time with my dog. Max was a 4-year-old German Shepherd with thick black and tan fur. He wasn't the friendliest with strangers, but with me he was loyal and calm. He had never let me down, and I trusted his instincts more than I trusted most people. I had always felt safe when he was with me, even if we were walking dark trails at night. The cabin was set back about half a mile from a dirt road, surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles. No neighbors in sight, no streetlights, nothing but trees and brush. The nearest town was 15 miles away. That first day I arrived, I carried in the supplies: water jugs, a cooler of food, a kerosene lantern, extra batteries, a small generator, and firewood. The cabin had no running water and no electricity besides what I could power on my own. The air was crisp, and the ground was damp with fallen leaves. The first night passed without issue. I started a fire in the old iron stove, cooked some beans in a pan, and sat with Max by my side while the wind rattled the loose boards on the siding. I slept on the thin mattress in the back room, Max curled up near the foot of the bed. I felt content. The next day I spent exploring the woods. The air smelled of wet pine needles, and the ground was soft underfoot. Max ran ahead, darting through the trees, sometimes circling back to check on me. At one point, he froze, ears pricked forward, body stiff. I stopped too, waiting. I didn't hear or see anything, but after a minute he relaxed and trotted on. I didn't think much of it. Wild animals were common out here: deer, raccoons, even black bears sometimes. That second night, things began to feel different. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of Max growling low, deep in his throat. He was standing at the window, body tense, tail stiff. The lantern had burned out, so the room was pitch black, only faint moonlight slipping through the cracks in the boards. I sat up and listened. At first, I heard nothing but the rustle of leaves. Then, faintly, I heard it. The sound of crunching footsteps outside, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I stayed still, every nerve awake, trying to steady my breathing. The steps weren't rushed or careless. They were steady, deliberate, moving around the cabin like someone was checking the walls, the doors, the windows. Max pressed his nose against the glass, teeth bared. My mind raced. A hunter? A lost hiker? But who walks around a stranger's cabin at 2 in the morning without calling out? I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed, but I didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to give away where I was. The footsteps went quiet after a while, but Max stayed tense for another 10 minutes before finally lying down again. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground was wet and soft enough to hold tracks. Sure enough, there were footprints in the mud. They weren't boots like a hunter would wear, but old sneakers, worn thin by the look of the tread. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows and the back door before heading off into the woods. The prints were larger than mine, wider too. That day, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting someone to step out and stare back. Max was restless too, sniffing the air, staying close to me instead of running off. I thought about packing up, but I convinced myself it might have just been someone passing through. The woods weren't private property. Maybe they were curious. Still, I kept my pistol close that day, tucked into my waistband whenever I stepped outside. The third night was worse. Around midnight, Max started growling again. This time it was sharper, more urgent. I heard the footsteps quicker this time, crunching on the leaves right up to the porch. I held my breath as the wood creaked under someone's weight. Whoever it was stood right outside the door. No knock, just silence. Max barked loud then, a deep, angry bark that echoed through the cabin. I heard the person step back, the boards creaking again. Then silence. I sat in the dark, gun in my hand, waiting for hours. My ears picked up every sound: the wind, the snapping branches, the distant call of an owl. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke again near dawn, exhausted. When I went outside, I saw it clearly: muddy handprints on the window glass, smeared as if someone had leaned in to look inside. The porch boards were wet with fresh prints. Whoever it was hadn't just walked by, they had been trying to watch me. That morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed most of my things into the truck, but I left some supplies inside since I wanted to make one last hike before leaving. I needed to clear my head. Max stayed close, ears constantly turning, nose twitching at every sound. The woods felt different now, heavier, as if someone was always just beyond sight. I didn't go far, only a mile down the trail. When I came back, I froze. On the cabin door, someone had carved a mark with a knife. A single long slash through the wood. Nothing else. Just that. I didn't go inside. I didn't check if anything had been touched. I loaded Max into the truck, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove down the dirt road. My heart pounded the entire way until I hit the main highway and saw other cars again. For weeks afterward, I thought about what had happened. Maybe it was some drifter living in the woods. Maybe someone watching cabins for easy break-ins. I never found out, but I knew one thing. If I hadn't brought Max with me, if he hadn't barked when he did, maybe that door would have opened one of those nights. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, when I think of it, I still picture those muddy handprints on the glass, the knife mark on the door, and the sound of slow footsteps circling me while I sat in the dark. Max saved me without even knowing it. That trip taught me the woods weren't just quiet trees and fresh air. They also hid the kind of silence that watched you back. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to spend a week at a small cabin I had inherited from my uncle. The cabin sat deep in the mountains of northern Idaho, far from any main road, surrounded by pine trees so tall they blocked out most of the sky. I had only been there once before as a child, and I remembered it as a quiet, almost peaceful place. I wanted the silence now. I had just turned 30, and my life back in Spokane felt noisy and crowded. The cabin was supposed to be my break from everything. The drive up took hours. The narrow dirt road twisted through the forest until I could barely see where my truck's headlights were landing. By the time I parked near the cabin, the air had that cold bite that always seems to creep in at dusk in the mountains, even in summer. I unloaded the boxes of food and supplies I had packed and carried them inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust the moment I stepped in. The air felt heavier, like the place hadn't been opened in years. The cabin was small, just one main room with a fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. The windows were coated with dirt, and the shutters outside rattled with each breeze. There was no electricity, only an old kerosene lantern that still worked after I filled it. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the wood settling. I tried to tell myself that was normal, but even small sounds carried differently out there. The first night passed without much trouble. I sat by the fireplace, ate canned soup, and listened to the forest outside. Every once in a while, I'd hear an owl or something moving through the brush, but nothing alarming. When I finally laid down on the thin mattress, I stared up at the ceiling beams, watching the shadows from the lantern sway until my eyes closed. The second night, I noticed something odd. Around midnight, when I had just drifted off, I woke up to a faint crunching sound outside. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps moving across the gravel near the fire pit. I held my breath, listening. At first, I thought it could be a deer, but the steps were too steady, too heavy. I sat up in bed, my ears straining. After a minute, the sound stopped. I didn't move for a long time, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, and I laid back down. Still, it took hours to fall asleep again. By the third night, the feeling of being watched had crept into my bones. Even during the day, as I chopped wood or went to the creek to fetch water, I found myself looking over my shoulder. The forest was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. Birds were absent. I didn't even hear squirrels. When I walked the trail behind the cabin, I found a set of boot prints in the mud. They were old, but not too old, maybe a few days. I tried to brush it off as hunters passing through, but the prints bothered me. They were deep, as if the man had been carrying weight on his back. That night it rained, a steady downpour that drummed on the tin roof. I should have felt safer with the noise covering everything else, but instead, I couldn't shake the unease. Around 2 in the morning, I woke again. This time, I was sure I had heard something outside the wall. Not footsteps, but something lighter, like fingers brushing the wooden planks. My heart pounded. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed and switched it on, but the weak beam didn't reach far into the corners of the room. I didn't dare open the door. I sat there, gripping the flashlight until the rain finally lulled me back into sleep. The next morning, I found something that chilled me. Near the front steps in the mud was a footprint. It wasn't mine. It was larger, the tread deeper, and it was fresh. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Someone had been out there during the night. Someone had been close enough to touch the cabin. I spent the whole day tense, double-checking the lock on the door and making sure the shutters were tight. I carried the old hunting rifle my uncle had left behind, though I wasn't sure if it even worked properly. When night came, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the lantern dimmed low, watching the door, listening. The silence pressed against my ears until I could hear my own breathing echo in my head. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. This time, they circled the cabin. I followed the sound with my eyes, imagining the path outside. Whoever it was, they were walking the perimeter, dragging something along the wall. At one point, the sound stopped near the window. I froze. My lantern was still burning faintly, and I thought about blowing it out, but I was too scared to move. Then came the sound of the shutters creaking. Someone was testing them. My throat tightened, and I raised the rifle, aiming at the door even though my hands shook. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then the footsteps moved again, slow, steady, until they faded into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I packed my things. I had planned to stay a week, but I couldn't take another night like that. When I stepped outside, the woods looked the same as they always had, but I felt exposed, like eyes were on me from every direction. I locked the cabin, though I knew it wouldn't matter much, and loaded my things into the truck. As I pulled away down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Just for a moment, through the trees, I swore I saw movement, a figure standing still between the pines, watching the road. I didn't slow down to check. I drove until the dirt turned to gravel and gravel turned to pavement. By the time I reached town, the weight in my chest finally eased, but the unease never left me. I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen. Someone had been out there, circling that cabin, waiting for something. Maybe they had been watching for days. Maybe they had been there long before I arrived. I never went back to that cabin. Not once. I left it to rot in the woods, too far away and too full of shadows. Some places, I realized, are meant to stay empty. I had always liked taking long drives out into the quieter parts of the state, where the roads turned narrow and the forests closed in on either side. It was late October of 1998 when I headed north into the hills of northern Pennsylvania, just past the Allegheny forest line. I was 28 at the time, restless, not married, and working in a warehouse job that left me wanting to get out whenever I could. That weekend I decided to camp, just myself, some gear in the back of my old Chevy pickup, and a plan to find a good fishing spot by one of the smaller creeks that branched off the Clarion River. By the second day of driving, I was deeper in the hills than I planned. The map I had wasn't much help, and I realized quickly how easy it was to get lost back there. Cell phones weren't like they are now, and mine didn't even have signal past the first ridge. The dirt road I was following broke off into smaller ones, most without signs, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen another car. I was low on gas, but figured I'd push until I found a clearing big enough to set up camp. The road narrowed into a muddy trail and finally stopped dead at a wall of trees. I backed out, tires spinning in wet leaves, and that's when I saw it. Through the trees about 100 yards off, sitting crooked on a patch of clearing, was an old cabin. The roof was sagging, shingles missing, and the windows looked black and hollow. The grass around it was high, almost to my knees when I stepped off the road, and I could see no path leading to it. It looked abandoned, maybe for decades. The logs were gray, rotted in places, and one corner of the porch had collapsed, leaving the railing twisted like broken ribs. Still, I felt a pull toward it. My truck wasn't going anywhere useful. I had daylight left, and I figured if nothing else, I could at least set up my sleeping bag under the porch roof. Shelter was shelter. The closer I got, the quieter the woods seemed.
No birds, no rustling.
Just wind brushing through the grass. The door hung half open, leaning on a busted hinge. I pushed it the rest of the way, and it screeched so loud it echoed inside. The smell hit first: mold, damp wood, and something sharp like rusted iron. The floor was soft under my boots, dust thick enough to leave footprints. Broken chairs, a stove with its door hanging open, and a table with one leg snapped were scattered in the main room. The place looked like someone had just left everything behind years ago. I set my pack down and walked room to room. There were only two: main space with the stove, then a smaller one off to the side that must have been a bedroom. The bed frame was still there, metal rusted, springs broken. A rotted mattress leaned against the wall. In the corner, an old dresser stood with one drawer half open, and when I tugged it, I found some folded clothes, eaten through by moths. A pair of boots sat beside it, cracked and stiff with age. The oddest part was that everything felt untouched but not destroyed. No graffiti, no beer cans, nothing that showed kids or hunters had used it in years. It was like the woods had just swallowed it whole and forgotten it. I set up in the main room, rolled out my bag, got a small fire going in the stove with some twigs and scraps I gathered outside. The crackle of flames made the cabin feel a little less dead, but the heat barely spread. Cold drafts kept creeping through the walls, through gaps where the logs had split. By nightfall, it was too dark to do anything but sit there, listening to the fire and the settling groans of the cabin. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time my eyes shut, I'd hear some new sound. The drip of water somewhere, the groan of wood shifting, something brushing outside against the walls. At one point I swore I heard faint steps on the porch, but when I sat up, heart pounding, nothing followed. I finally drifted off but woke again in the dead of night, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. The fire had died, leaving the room black and cold. My breath showed in pale clouds. I pulled my flashlight from my bag and clicked it on. The beam cut across the room, and for a second I thought I saw movement in the far corner. Just a shape, low to the ground. But when I swung the light back, nothing was there. That was when I noticed the smell again. Stronger now, like old meat left to rot in the sun, sharp and sour, coming from the direction of the small bedroom. I tried to tell myself it was the mattress or some animal that had died years ago in the walls. Still, the stink made my stomach turn, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't sleep again, I sat against the wall with my light in my lap until the faint gray of dawn pushed through the broken windows. By morning, I was done with the place. My skin felt tight, nerves shot, and the air in that cabin was thick and heavy like it didn't want me breathing it. When I stepped outside, I circled around the cabin. That's when I noticed something I hadn't the day before. On the backside, under one of the boarded windows, the ground looked dug up. The earth was darker, loose compared to the packed soil around it. I crouched down and pressed my hand to it. It was damp, like it had been turned over recently. I found myself staring too long. My brain tried to push explanations. Maybe an animal had been digging, maybe the soil had shifted, but deep down I knew it wasn't that. The shape of the patch was too clean, rectangular, about the size of a grave. The smell was stronger there too. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my gear from inside, didn't bother to roll the bag properly, just stuffed it into the truck bed. The drive back was rough, the trail muddy and narrow, but I didn't stop until I reached a real road. I didn't tell anyone about it for years. Not friends, not family. Stuck in my head though, the silence of that cabin, the smell, the dug-up ground. Maybe it was a hunter's dumping spot, maybe someone had buried something or someone. I never knew. The worst part is I can still picture it. The tilt of the porch, the sagging roof, the way the trees seemed to bend toward it, closing it off from the world. I've driven past that area since, years later, and I never once saw the cabin again. It's as if it sank into the ground, swallowed for good. But I know what I saw, and I know something was buried behind it. I just thank God I didn't stay another night. It was October of 1997 when I decided to spend a long weekend up north in a hunting cabin I had rented for the season. I was 32 at the time, living in Wisconsin, and had been working in a machine shop for years. My life felt routine, and hunting had always been the one thing that allowed me to disconnect from everything and feel grounded again. The cabin sat about 2 miles off a narrow gravel road, tucked between thick pines and old oaks. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a small stove, a cot, a table, and a few hooks for coats and gear. But to me, it was perfect. I drove up early Friday morning in my old Chevy, the bed of the truck filled with firewood, my .30-06 rifle, and enough supplies to last me through the weekend. The air was sharp, cold enough to see my breath, and the leaves were already deep red and orange, carpeting the ground in thick layers that muffled my boots. The cabin looked the same as it had the year before: gray, weathered logs, a sagging roof, and a crooked stone chimney that had black soot stains down the side. I unpacked my things slowly, stacking firewood against the wall inside and setting my rifle near the cot. I had no neighbors for at least a mile or more, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves and the occasional caw of crows. I felt calm, but there was always a certain edge that came with being out there alone. I locked the truck, shut the door to the cabin, and settled in. That first evening, I went out before sunset to scout a clearing about half a mile to the east. The trail there was faint, more of a deer path than anything, but I knew it well. The forest floor was damp, the smell of wet leaves and pine heavy in the air. I found fresh deer tracks near the clearing and noted the direction. I stayed out until the light began to fade, then walked back quickly, the woods closing in as the sky turned dark. Inside the cabin, I lit a lantern and cooked a simple meal on the stove: canned beans, bread, and jerky. I sat listening to the crackle of the fire and the wind pushing against the cabin walls. The silence in those woods was different than anything in town. It wasn't empty silence. It felt like something was always just beyond it, watching, waiting. That night, I slept light, waking several times to the sound of snapping branches outside. I told myself it was deer moving through the brush, but each time I opened my eyes, I stayed awake a little longer. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I dressed quietly, laced my boots, and stepped outside into the cold, damp air. A thin fog clung to the trees. I could see my breath with every exhale. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and walked the trail toward the clearing. The woods felt different that morning, quieter, heavier somehow. I moved slow, careful with each step to keep from making noise. I reached the clearing and set myself against a downed log, watching the tree line. Hours passed with no sign of anything. The sun rose, burning off the fog, and I started to think about heading back. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. At first I thought it was a deer, but when I focused, I realized it wasn't. It was a man. He was standing at the far end of the clearing, maybe 100 yards away. He wasn't moving toward me, just standing half in the shadow of the trees. I thought maybe another hunter had stumbled into the area, but something about him was wrong. He wasn't wearing hunter's orange, and he didn't have a rifle. From the distance, I couldn't make out details of his face, but I could tell his clothes looked dark and ragged. I froze. I didn't wave, didn't call out. I just sat there, half hidden behind the log, hoping he hadn't seen me. For what felt like minutes he didn't move, and then, slowly, he stepped back into the trees and was gone. I stayed in place longer than I should have, trying to decide what to do. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but I had driven hours to be there, and I didn't want to believe there was any real danger. I finally stood and made my way back to the cabin, constantly checking over my shoulder. The rest of the day I stayed inside, cleaning my rifle and trying to convince myself it had been nothing. Maybe just another hunter who didn't follow the rules, maybe a drifter passing through. Still, every creak outside set me on edge. When night came, I stacked wood into the stove and sat listening to the fire. I could hear the wind pushing against the roof, but underneath it I swore I heard faint footsteps in the leaves outside. Slow, deliberate, I blew out the lantern and sat in darkness, my rifle across my lap. The footsteps would stop, then start again, circling, always staying just far enough that I couldn't see anyone through the small window. I sat like that for hours, heart hammering, until finally exhaustion won and I dozed off against the cot. I woke to a sound that snapped me upright. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was the sound of the cabin door handle being tried. The metal rattled softly, back and forth, someone testing it. My rifle was already in my hands. I kept it pointed at the door, my finger tight against the trigger guard. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't speak. They just tested the handle again. Then after what felt like forever, it stopped. The rest of that night, I didn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook as I loaded the truck. I didn't care about the firewood I had carried in, or the food I hadn't eaten. I just wanted out. Driving back down that narrow trail, every shadow between the trees felt like it was holding someone. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally hit the gravel road and the open highway, only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding since the night before. I never reported it. I never told anyone the details, just that the cabin wasn't for me anymore. Maybe it was a squatter, maybe some drifter who thought the cabin was empty and wanted in. Or maybe it was someone who had been watching from the woods, waiting for the right chance. All I know is this: I never went back. That cabin still sits up there, I'm sure, rotting deeper into the woods. But the memory of standing in that clearing, seeing that man at the edge, and hearing that doorknob turn in the dark, that's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. I was 31 the year I decided to stay at that old farm cabin in rural Arkansas. It wasn't mine, but a friend of mine had offered it to me for a week after I told him I needed some time away from people. I was burned out from working nights at the shipping warehouse, and I thought a quiet place, far from the noise of the city, would do me good. The cabin sat at the edge of his family's farmland, about a quarter-mile from the main house, surrounded on three sides by thick woods, and one side opening up to a wide field of corn that reached almost chest height that summer. The first day felt peaceful. The cabin smelled of pine and dust, the kind of dry air that clings to old wood. It was one room with a stove, a small cot, a rocking chair, and shelves lined with jars of pickled vegetables his grandparents had probably stored decades ago. The windows were old, single pane, and some of them stuck when I tried to open them. I had no cell service out there, which I liked. No internet either. Just me, the cabin, and the land. The nights were louder than I expected. At first, I thought it would be silence, but it wasn't. Frogs croaked endlessly from somewhere near a stream I couldn't see. Crickets buzzed from every corner. Sometimes coyotes yipped and howled, distant but sharp enough to carry across the fields. The first night, I barely slept, just lay there listening, staring up at the ceiling beams. By the third night, I started to settle into the rhythm of it. I would walk the fields during the day, sit out on the porch in the evening with a lantern, and try to sketch or write down thoughts. My friend had left an old shotgun in the corner, leaning against the wall. I didn't touch it at first. I grew up around guns, but never liked them much. Still, it was there and I couldn't ignore it. On the fourth night, something changed. I had left the lantern on the porch burning while I sat inside reading an old farm almanac I found on the shelf. Around midnight, I noticed the sound of movement in the cornfield. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. The stalks rustled, steady, deliberate, like something was pushing through them. I sat still and listened. The rustling moved closer to the cabin, then stopped. The frogs and crickets seemed to hush all at once, leaving only the faint hum of the lantern flame. I felt my chest tighten. I told myself it was a deer, maybe even a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 10 minutes of silence, I finally blew out the lantern and lay down on the cot. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked the edge of the cornfield. The soil was soft from a rain earlier that week, and I found something that unsettled me. Not deer tracks, not raccoon.
Bare footprints.
Human. They were long, narrow, and pressed deep into the mud, circling the cabin in uneven steps. Whoever it was had been barefoot. I tried to explain it away. Maybe kids from the nearby farms were messing around, though the nearest neighbor was miles down the road. Still, the prints were fresh, clear as day. I stopped walking the field after that and kept closer to the cabin. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the tree line, I locked the cabin door. The lock was just a rusty old bolt, nothing strong. I pushed a chair under the handle too, just in case. I kept the shotgun loaded and resting by the cot. For the first time, I felt unsafe. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of slow, steady footsteps on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. My mouth went dry, my body stiff. Whoever it was, they stood there for a long time, not moving, just standing. I didn't breathe. I didn't dare look out the window. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved again, circling the cabin. Gravel crunched outside, then silence. I sat awake until dawn, gripping the shotgun so hard my hands ached. When the sun came up, I opened the door. Nothing. No footprints this time. The ground had hardened overnight. Still, I knew what I'd heard. By the 6th day, I was worn down from lack of sleep. My head felt heavy all the time. I jumped at every sound, even the normal ones. The cabin, which had felt safe at first, now felt like a trap. I thought about leaving early, walking the long dirt road back to town, but my pride kept me there. I told myself I could handle it. That night was the worst. Just after midnight, I heard scratching on the side of the cabin. Light, slow, like fingernails dragging across the wood. Then, tapping on the window nearest to my cot.
Top, top, top.
I froze. My body wouldn't move. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. I finally snapped out of it, grabbed the shotgun, and pointed it at the door. The tapping stopped. Minutes later, the doorknob rattled. The bolt held, but the sound of someone trying it sent chills through me. I shouted out, a raw sound, not even words, just to let them know I was armed. Silence followed, but I didn't relax. Hours passed before I finally saw the first light of morning seep through the cracks of the shutters. When the sun rose, I opened the door again, heart pounding. This time there were marks on the wood of the door, scratches carved deep into it. They weren't animal marks. They were deliberate, long grooves in the shape of letters, though not neat. It almost looked like someone had tried to carve a name, but stopped halfway. I didn't stay to figure out what it meant. I packed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and left the cabin that morning. I didn't even bother to put the chair back or clean up. I walked the dirt road until I found someone driving a truck into town, and they gave me a ride back. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend something vague about not feeling comfortable there, but I never mentioned the footprints or the scratching. He still uses it during hunting season. Even now, years later, I can't sleep if I hear tapping at the window, even if it's just a branch. I can't stand the sound of footsteps outside at night. The cabin was supposed to give me peace, but all it gave me was proof that sometimes the scariest thing isn't ghosts or monsters. It's knowing there's someone out there, in the dark, watching you, and you'll never know why. I had been driving most of the day before I reached the old cabin. It was late autumn of 2011, and the sun had already slipped behind the jagged mountains of northern Arizona. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, a man who let people use it if they wanted a break from town life. I was 27 then, worn down from long shifts at a warehouse, and I thought a weekend in the quiet would be the reset I needed. The dirt road leading up was rough, the kind where you feel every stone through the tires. The trees grew thick on either side, juniper and pine pressing in close, and the headlights barely cut a path through the branches. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked like something half forgotten, wood weathered gray, a single tin chimney poking through the roof. There was no electricity, no cell service, just a propane lamp, a wood stove, and silence thick enough to make your ears ring. Inside, the place smelled of dust and dry wood. The floors creaked under my boots. A single bed frame with a sagging mattress sat against one wall. There was a shelf with some cans of beans and old coffee, rust on the edges. I swept away cobwebs, unpacked my small duffel, and tried to settle in. By nightfall, the quiet started to feel heavier. I lit the propane lamp, the hiss of gas filling the room, and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the moon was high, pale, and cold. That's when I noticed something strange. In the dirt patch near the treeline, about 30 yards out, there were tracks. Not just animal tracks, they were spaced too wide, too irregular. Some looked like coyote prints, others like barefoot human steps, deep in the soil as if someone heavy had walked there. They seemed to weave together, coyote and human side by side, crossing back and forth. I told myself it was just hunters, maybe kids messing around. I didn't think much more of it until later. That night, I lay on the bed, wrapped in my jacket because the cabin leaked cold through the walls. The wood stove didn't do much. I drifted in and out of sleep, half dreaming, when I heard it. Not loud, but clear enough. The sound of footsteps on dirt outside. Not a steady walk, but uneven, dragging, like something wasn't moving right. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The steps circled the cabin slowly, crunching against the gravel. The nearest ranch was miles away. Nobody should have been out there at that hour. I didn't move, just listened as the sound passed by the window. For a second, I thought I saw a shape cut across the moonlight, a thin figure moving low to the ground. I sat up, heart hammering, but by the time I peered through the glass, there was nothing, only the trees swaying. The footsteps stopped after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the dirt. Sure enough, the tracks were there again. Human barefoot prints, deep and wide, circling the cabin. And alongside them, the prints of an animal large, paw-shaped, but twisted, almost like the toes had stretched too far. They led back into the trees, vanishing in the underbrush. The air felt colder that day, sharper. I tried to distract myself by chopping some wood and walking the edge of the clearing, but every so often I had the prickling sensation of eyes on me. Birds would stop chirping suddenly. The silence was so thick it felt like pressure on my ears. By late afternoon, I was restless. I didn't want to spend another night there, but the sun was already dropping. The dirt road was rough and winding, and I wasn't sure I could navigate it safely in the dark. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, it came back. I had killed the propane lamp early, letting the cabin fall into darkness. I thought maybe if I kept quiet, whatever was outside would leave me alone. But lying there in the dark only made every noise sharper. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of steps again, this time closer, heavier. The sound moved right up to the porch. The wooden boards groaned like weight pressed against them. I could hear shallow breathing, like someone trying not to be heard. My pulse raced. I stared at the door, the thin wooden latch all that stood between me and whatever was out there. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate drags across the wood, as if nails or claws were tracing the shape of the doorframe. It lasted minutes, each scrape dragging down my spine. I gripped the old hunting knife I'd found in a drawer, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed to bolt, to run into the dark woods, but I forced myself still. Finally, the sound stopped. The boards creaked again as the weight shifted away. I sat awake until dawn, clutching the knife. When light finally bled through the window, I stumbled outside, exhausted but alive. In the dirt, fresh tracks covered the ground around the porch. Human prints, bare, long strides, circling in strange patterns. And beside them, those twisted paw prints again, as if whatever it was had changed shape halfway through. The tracks led off into the trees, swallowed by the forest. I didn't wait. I packed what little I had, threw it in the car, and drove that dirt road faster than I should have. My hands shook on the wheel, and every shadow between the trees looked like it was following me. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and sat there, engine idling, staring back at the dirt road. The cabin was hidden now, swallowed by the distance, but I felt like if I stayed even a minute longer, something would come out of those woods after me. I never went back. Later, when I told a friend about the tracks, about the noises, he gave me a look and said I'd been near Navajo land, where stories about skinwalkers were whispered. I didn't want to believe it. I still don't. What I know for sure is this: someone or something was out there those nights. They weren't lost hunters. They weren't kids messing around. The weight in those footsteps, the way the tracks shifted from human to animal, the sound of breathing inches from the thin cabin door, none of it felt human. To this day, I can still hear that slow, dragging scratch on the wood if I lie awake at night too long. And I know if I ever set foot near that cabin again, I wouldn't walk back out. I remember that night more vividly than I wish I did. It was in the fall of 2003 in the northern part of Maine, where the trees grow thick and the roads thin out to little more than dirt paths. I was 26 then, and I had borrowed my uncle's old cabin for a week to get away from the city. It wasn't much of a cabin, just a small square wooden structure with 2 rooms, one being the bedroom and the other serving as both the kitchen and living space. It sat back off a gravel road, hidden by tall pine trees, with a half-rotted porch that sagged under its own weight. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my old pickup beside the tree line, and carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled like damp wood and old smoke. I could tell it hadn't been used in a while, but it was still solid enough. There was no electricity out there, just a wood stove and a kerosene lantern. The silence was thick, broken only by the rustling of branches outside. I told myself I came for the silence, but once I was actually sitting in it, I realized how heavy silence can feel. That first night passed without much happening. I started a fire in the stove, heated up some canned beans, and read by lantern light until I got tired. The bed creaked when I lay down, and the wind tapped at the loose boards, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I was used to camping, used to being outdoors. This wasn't much different, I thought. The second night was when things started to feel wrong. I had gone out earlier in the day, walked about 2 miles into the woods, and tried to fish at a small lake I had seen on the map. I didn't catch anything, but the hike wore me out. By evening, I was back at the cabin, sore and hungry. I made another simple meal and sat outside on the porch steps as the sun went down. The air grew colder fast. I remember watching the light drain from the sky until only the outline of the trees was left. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, like something snapping a branch out in the woods. I figured it was a deer, but then I heard it again, closer. A heavy step, not fast, not rushed, but steady, like someone walking. I leaned forward, staring into the dark, but I couldn't see a thing. The trees were packed too tightly together. After a while, the noise stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. Still, I didn't linger outside. I went back in, bolted the old wooden door, and sat down with my lantern lit. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint sounds from outside. Sometimes it was like movement, other times like a soft scrape against the porch boards. Every time I thought it was gone, it would start again. I didn't want to open the door. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear or even just raccoons. But the strange part was the pattern. It wasn't random noise. It came and went in a way that felt deliberate, like steps circling the cabin. By dawn, I was exhausted. I stepped outside with my coffee and saw the dirt around the porch had been disturbed. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but when I crouched down, I froze. They weren't paw prints. They were footprints, bare feet, human. The size looked to be from a grown man, long and flat in the mud where it had rained the day before. They went right up to the porch, stopped at the door, then looped around the cabin and disappeared into the woods again. The sight made my stomach twist. I was miles away from anyone. The nearest town was 20 minutes by car, and the cabin wasn't easy to find unless you knew exactly where it was. My uncle had said no one else used it. Whoever had come near the cabin that night had walked barefoot through the woods and stood at my door. I tried to make sense of it, but nothing made it feel better. That day, I debated leaving. I loaded some of my things into the truck just in case, but then I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was some drifter passing through. Maybe kids messing around, though I didn't know where they would have come from. The thought of driving back to the city with my tail between my legs bothered me, so I stayed. The third night is burned into my memory like a scar. I had stacked extra firewood inside, locked the door, and kept the lantern on longer than usual. Around midnight, I finally blew it out and tried to sleep, but only an hour later, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. A slow, dragging noise, like fingers tracing the wood. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst. I lay still, listening. The noise stopped, then came a soft creak from the porch boards. Whoever it was had stepped onto it. The door rattled gently, just once, like someone testing the handle. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My uncle's rifle was hanging on the wall above the bed, but I was too scared to even reach for it. The door didn't open, but the sound of breathing came through the thin wood. Slow, steady breaths right outside where I lay. Minutes passed, maybe longer, I couldn't tell. Then, as quietly as it had started, it stopped. I waited until dawn before I dared move. When I finally opened the door, the prints were there again. Bare feet in the dirt, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, pausing at the door. I didn't bother packing everything. I just grabbed my bags, threw them into the truck, and got out. I drove fast, the gravel spitting under my tires, checking my mirrors the whole way like I expected to see someone following. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved road. When I got back to town, I told my uncle what I had seen. He looked at me for a long time, then said the woods out there had always drawn in strange people. Hunters who never left, squatters who lived where no one looked for them, drifters passing through. He said he'd had his own odd moments out there, though he never told me the details. I never went back. My uncle still keeps the cabin, though he doesn't use it much anymore. Sometimes I think about those footprints, about the steady breathing outside the door. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't kids. It was a man, walking barefoot through the forest in the middle of the night, circling a cabin he didn't belong to. That's the part that stays with me. Not knowing who he was or why he came, only that he had been there, watching me from the dark, close enough to touch the door between us. I learned something in those nights, that the scariest things aren't the stories people tell about ghosts or creatures. The scariest things are the people who live just beyond what we can see. The ones who step silently out of the woods when we think we're alone. And out there, in that cabin, I was never really alone.